Now let's go on to some examples of artillery firepower. In this particular example I'm going to run with this 8-pound, 8-gun French battery against this Austrian column behind the hedge. Now the first thing I have to determine is the column actually within the firing arc, and can I see sufficient amount of the enemy unit to be able to fire? Well, I'm clearly almost in front of it, so I certainly am going to be within the firing arc, but just to be sure, I'm going to put down the template. And here's an example of a template. Notice this little notch at the corner here. This notch goes on the corner of the base of the battery. Okay, that determines my right side. Looks good. Put it over here on the left side. Good. So this is certainly within my angle of fire. And I can get both sides of the battery and aim at the unit too. There's no enemy units in the front or foreground. It's not being screened. So this should be a fairly straightforward calculation. So pulling out my artillery firepower chart, which hopefully the players will take their own and follow as I go along. First thing is I'm going to look for the type of cannon I'm firing. 8-pound gun. There we go, halfway down on the first left-hand column. And I'm firing round shot. If I didn't call my shot, it would automatically be round shot by definition, especially once I've rolled the dice. And once I've determined that, I have to figure out how many cannon I'm firing. We already know that's 8 guns because it's a 1/4 inch per gun, 2-inch wide base, therefore it's 8 guns, and there's no loss of gun markers on the respective base. So I find the number 8, and then I come on down. French artillery is a Class A firer, and then I have to make a choice between two percentages of 110 or 73. Well, the 110 is for, if I'm looking off to the left side, is a mass target, so that's the one I'm going to utilize. It's a base 110. And then I have to look up to see if the hedge has any firepower effect for the terrain. And look under the round shot column on the artillery firepower or firepower morale modifiers, and it comes down and it shows no effect. In other words, it's got no reduction. So I have a base of 110% to cause a possible loss on that Austrian battalion. Well, it's automatically going to lose 1 because I'm at 100% to start with. And then there's a 10% chance for the second figure. In this case, I rolled a 52. So there's no additional loss. If no other firepower of artillery was given against that battalion, at the end of the artillery fire phase, it will take a morale check to determine its current morale status, if it stays, runs, or just goes into morale disorder. That's a pretty simplistic check. But let's say I shot canister instead. Well, canister, doing the same process, 8-pound case or canister, 8 guns. The base against a mass target is 132. But canister, when it fires over the hedge, is reduced by 1/4, so it's 75% effectiveness, which makes it a 99% straight up shot. So if I roll anything but an 0-0, the figures would be lost. And I rolled an 0-9, which is 9%. So there's a figure lost. Again, after the artillery fire is all done in the artillery fire phase, you take your morale checks and things of that nature. So that's pretty clean cut. First observation, if you're in a mass formation and there's an enemy gun firing at you, you're going to start taking losses pretty quickly. So let's go on to some different firepowers. Let's take this gun and we're going to fire it at this screen. Well, just like in this table, you're going to look at it, but in this case it's not a mass target anymore. So I'm going to drop down to the 73, and being a full skirmisher out in front of me, that's a 1/4 firepower effective target, looking up on the modifiers table. So it's going to be 73 times 0.25 effectively. That's 18.25, or rounded up to the next full whole number. Remember, we round up to full whole numbers, 19%. Rolled a 54, no effect in this case. If I had rolled a 19 or less, one of these figures would have been dropped. Now you can use artillery firepower, unlike infantry firepower, and fire through an enemy screen at a unit which is directly behind. Remember, these skirmishers are out in the battlefield, someplace in this no man's land. They're not exactly right here. We just put them on the tabletop in an exact location so we have an ability to march up against them and figure out how to do combat against them. But they're lurking around out in this open area. So they're giving this unit a screen, and they also represent, this is a sidebar, the screens represent the smoke of the battlefield, artificially. Instead of us putting smoke clouds all over the field, we just say if there's skirmishes between the armies, there's smoke clouds between the armies, which reduces the visibility of the artillery to be able to range in. So it does a sort of a combination of things in our game. In this case, I'm going to fire at this line. In this case, it will be the same percentage as 73, but when you fire at a screened target, in other words, there's an open order formation between you and the target, it's 1/3 effectiveness. So it would be 73 times 0.3334. 24 in fraction rounds up to 25%. In this case, I rolled a 48, there's no effect. But if I had rolled a 20, let's say, for example, then one figure of the Prussians would have been dropped and there would be an upcoming morale check. Let's say we're firing at enemy cavalry. By the way, if you fire at a square, it's considered a mass target, just like a column, because there's more than one rank of figures. Very simple rule to understand. If you fire at cavalry, there's nothing between us, no screening or anything of that nature. It would be a straight linear target in this case, because it's a single rank of cavalry. So it would be the 73% reduced by a fifth. Anytime you shoot at cavalry, it's reduced by a fifth. And this, again, as I've mentioned earlier, is because of the faster movement of the cavalry. It generally did not stay still on the battlefield. It was typically moving around. And of course, if it's ever in a state of charge or anything of that nature, it's coming at so rapidly that your amount of fire opportunities, in other words, volleys, shall we say, are considerably reduced. And that's why we reduce the cavalry by a fifth, even though it is theoretically a higher or a larger target. So it would be 73 times 0.8, or 58 in a fraction, call it 59%. They rolled an 85, they missed. French weren't too good today on their firepower. But if I had rolled again, the proverbial 59 or less, they would have caused the loss of the figure and a morale check. That in a nutshell, in basics, is the artillery fire. Now keep in mind, terrain's always going to modify it in most cases, but not all, especially when you got softer or very weak type terrain. Round shot has a tendency to plunge right through it. And there's a couple other things which come into play, especially if you have massed artillery with artillery officers. One last thing, just as an example, over here on the left side, I had this one battery. This happens to be a Bergen battery, and theoretically it's in the angle to fire at this Austrian battalion. But as I mentioned earlier with the square on the right side, this French Léger battalion in line is physically blocking the projectiles or the path or the zone of cone of fire towards the Austrian battalion. So therefore I cannot fire this battery. For it to be able to fire at that Austrian column, I probably would have to have had it turned in this direction so I can get a clean angle from my corner of my base to the Austrian and see at least two figures of the infantry, of the Austrians that is. But because it's sort of embedded behind this Léger battalion, and I draw the line from this corner to the Austrians, it's crossing Léger, therefore it's blocked. Just keep in mind when you move your guns around, you always want to have a clear field of fire. You never know when you're going to need that firepower.